American dream is a wonderful thing. Study hard, work hard, and your talent and drive will determine your success. But even though we encourage our kids to make the sacrifices necessary to get the best education possible and to believe they have the power to be and do whatever they want, the road to that dream is not the same for everybody. Some Americans get to make mistakes along the way and still achieve what they wish for, while others do just about everything right and find their path full of obstacles. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. Brandolon Barnett was in that second group, the son of a black single mother who gave up her own dream of being an opera singer to work corporate jobs so she'd have what she needed to raise him. Brandolon did really well in school and went on to college and grad school, believing that the money he borrowed to fund his education would make it possible for him to change the world in important, positive ways. The thing is, a dream in America is not the same thing as a promise. Barnett finished his undergraduate degree in the late aughts, just as the U.S. economy was imploding on itself, and had to navigate extraordinary economic hardship and personal grief as he worked to build the kind of career he had always wanted. Brandolon Barnett is head of corporate social responsibility industry solutions in Salesforce.org's Philanthropy Cloud and leader of the Democratize Ventures Investing and Advisory Institute. And full disclosure, he worked on the Think Team many years ago, just as this show was getting off the ground. He was with us for about a year, but we have missed him ever since. His memoir is called Dreams Deferred: Recession, Struggle, and the Quest for a Better World. Brandolon, welcome back to Think.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's such an honor. I'm such a big fan.
I'm a big fan of yours as well. From the time you were a little kid, you say you tried to live your life so that it would make a good story. How did you define a good story back then?
Well, for me, a good story really meant one that did have, and this is kind of funny to say now, one that did have some complexity to it. I remember as a kid, my favorite books, my favorite movies were all stories that felt like they had kind of multiple eras. And in 2 hours, you feel like you'd maybe lived 2 years of a character's life. For me, that was a good story. I never expected for everything to be easy, but I never expected it to be as hard as it got at some times. And yeah, I would say that that good story is really defined by what you go through to get to the end of that journey, kind of the hero, the classic hero's journey, if you will.
Hmm. So you did a program in college called Semester at Sea that I know was a seminal experience for you. What did you learn about wealth and poverty and potential that you might not have understood in the same way as if you had never gone abroad?
Yeah, so for those unfamiliar, Semester at Sea is a program that allows college students to board a ship. It's a giant cruise ship, and on the ship, there are students and professors from universities all over the world. I was at the time a student at the University of Pittsburgh, and grew up in Dallas. I'd never, though, seen the ocean. I'd really never left the, 20 miles away from Dallas. And all of a sudden, I got a scholarship to go on this program through the support of a mentor. And I find myself flying to LA and then Vancouver and standing next to this boat, looking out at mountains that I'd never seen before, and the ocean, which I'd never seen before. And I boarded this ship and we went to 12 different countries. And in so many ways, that experience changed my idea of, well, so many things. The first thing it did was just open up my mind to what's possible in the world. Um, Growing up, my mother worked very hard, but we never had much growing up in Dallas and Oak Cliff specifically. And I had never really thought about certain career paths. But on this trip, as we arrived in port, 1,000 or so American students from every university you can imagine, we would be greeted by diplomats. We'd be greeted by professors who would give lectures. We would be greeted by economists, by government officials. And these were careers that I had never really considered for myself because I never saw an example in my own personal life. And that was one of the major changes, just this idea that there's a whole set of careers that are that just really resonated with me. The second was that the idea of what it means to be African American was different when I traveled. And the story I always tell was I was I was walking around Hong Kong, student on the trip. I had run out of money. So that's some important context for this story. I had been given a gift of a couple of $100s by the dean because I was completely broke. But as I was walking around, a gentleman was following me, and at some point I stopped. He'd been following me for miles, and I, said, it really feels like you're following me. I don't understand why. And he said, oh, I think that you probably got some money to spend in my shop. Turned out he was a tailor, and one of his best customers of the past month or so, or 2 months, had been an African American. And so he had developed a stereotype that African Americans were very wealthy. And, it's a silly story, but at the same time, I'd never thought of myself in that light.
Hmm.
I'd never seen myself as someone who could be that because I wasn't surrounded by it. I was on an island away from it, in fact. And so, those two experiences, this idea that I could be something more than, what other folks might have imposed on me and their thoughts of me, but also in being that something more, that there are these examples of careers and lives that I had never really thought about. Both of those things really transformed my life, I'd say completely.
So, in the spring of 2007, you graduate from the University of Pittsburgh, which I looked this up, currently requires a GPA above 4.0 just to be considered for admission, which is to say, highly selective. So, you leave with this valuable degree and $1,000 a month in student loan payments. It would seem like your degree from Pitt would have positioned you to make a lot of money right out of the gate, but you weren't driven by money.
I was never and have never been driven by money. And, there are some folks listening who might say, that makes me an idiot or that's to my detriment. And, believe me, some of the things I've gone through, I understand that argument. I have a rebuttal against it. But yeah, I decided to go a different path. First of all, it was hard for anyone graduating in '07, '08 to find work, let alone work that pays benefits. I mean, this is something that I think we're seeing right now. A lot of folks have gone through the past year and they've lost jobs. Are they going to be able to come back to work that is providing them with what they need to take care of those they love with benefits? For me, all of that was the case, but in an already difficult environment, that spirit that had been inspired in me to kind of explore these new careers, particularly around impact. I had discovered, what an NGO is, or a non-governmental organization. The desire to explore all of that overruled any kind of financial concerns. And I thought it would all work out. So I took work with a small international NGO called Globalware, based in Dallas, actually. And right out of college, I'd done an internship there. She entrusted me to go, the executive director, to travel to Ghana, Laos, Thailand, Costa Rica, Jamaica, to create programs for them, to liaise with local community organizations, and to create multimedia content to help them promote their international volunteering programs. And that further expanded my mind, but also further solidified my belief that, it's not all about money. It definitely wasn't for me. It was about this impact that I could have, which stems really from my love of science fiction. I'm a massive nerd. So I grew up reading science fiction like Babylon 5 and Star Trek. And I saw these better worlds that, again, I had begun to think, what's possible beyond what I experienced? So the idea of being part of shaping those better worlds became so powerful to me. And this work to me was essential because how can you say you're living in the Federation of Planets? How can you say that you've created a better world, right? That Jean-Luc Picard would be happy to live in if you still have people who don't have food and who don't have water? And so I saw being a part of solving those problems as part of this bigger narrative, this bigger story. All of it was connected to me in ways that inspired me, but also moved me at times unconsciously. It kind of just propelled me forward.
And everywhere you went, you would save up stories to share with your mom because you knew she would have loved traveling alongside you.
Yeah, my mother never left the country. She was an amazing woman. I know we all think our mothers are amazing, and they are. And she believed in me despite any trouble I got into. She believed in my abilities. And I would say at times it felt like she was the only one who did. And so wherever I went, whatever I did, I would catalog it for her. I would bring her gifts with, whatever of whatever kind I could bring or muster. I would have stories to tell her. And there were places where I would cry uh, because, for example, my mother loved music. You mentioned in the intro that she had tried to be an opera singer, and she had a music scholarship to college in Texas, one of the first in my family to go. And so I remember being in South Africa and listening to a boys' choir. And they were so beautiful. I just knew that she would love to hear them so much. Um, and that thought, just made me weep. And wherever I went, I would bring those stories back to her and hope that one day we could go together.
So, Brandolin, here is where our stories intersect. At the beginning of 2008, you came to work for KERA. As I was thinking about this question, I realized it sounds like a nonsense interview question, but I'm not sure it's one I thought to ask you at the time. What did the job on the Think team represent to you?
It represented an opportunity to make the world better in a way that I was familiar with. So it was a continuation on that same theme. But I'm sure many of your listeners, especially in Dallas, know the quality of this program, the quality of you, the quality of the station. And growing up, my mom was a single mom. She was very busy. And there were times where NPR, whether it was radio or KERA television, PBS, really educated me and opened my world in a million ways that were so similar to what I had experienced while traveling, whether it was like watching Nature or Nova or listening to Diane Rehm or to Think later. And the thought of being part of that was fascinating to me and just seemed like such an incredible place to be and energy to be around and way to make a difference.
Thank you for not saying you listened when you were a very small child, although you probably could have. Eventually, though, Brandolin, you realized your dream wasn't to make a show about ideas, it was to have the ideas that would change the world. Is that what brought you officially to apply to be a Foreign Service officer?
Yeah. So one of the themes that I touch on in the book that I didn't realize was a theme until I was writing it, working with the publisher and the editors, was the theme of freedom. And I think the first part of my life as an adult, I discovered all these new ways that I could think of myself, these new kinds of careers that I could have. And it was a kind of freedom from what I felt had been imposed upon me. Because even if it's not explicit, even if no one ever says it, the idea that you're going to do what other people in your community does is always kind of something that you feel very strongly wherever you grew up. And so that was the first kind of freedom that I discovered, the freedom to think that I could be something more, something different, something that I wanted to be. The second was the freedom that came when I worked at KRA, which is I really learned about the freedom that comes from being listened to. So being at the station and then, being more involved in media, because working in media doesn't mean that you're just creating a program and then going about your life. It means that you're listening to other programs. It means that you're exposed to what's going on and you're seeing all of that through a different lens. So it really struck a nerve in me that I now realize was a recognition of kind of the freedom to just be heard. And the past 2 years have been really amazing on that front because, as an African American man, I'm just realizing even more strongly in ways that I kind of, I think, maybe suppressed, how often, how little we can be listened to as, people of color, women and men in America. But, getting beyond that, it just struck me that it was so powerful to have ideas, but what then about implementation? What accounts for that? And so while I was on semester at sea, I'd encountered diplomats, and I'd thought about it as a career path, and even kind of made it a goal. But this idea that I wanted this freedom to be whatever I wanted financial stability, another kind of freedom that I clearly had lacked in some ways, and then the freedom to have ideas, and then how do I then get the ability to act on them? That's what attracted me to the Foreign Service. And I remember coming to DC, which is the only place my mother and I traveled to. She came here for work. I now live in DC. She came here when I was a kid, stepped out of the metro, the Smithsonian stop, walked up, and it was snowing. Grew up in Texas, had never really seen snow in my life, so that was amazing. Look to the right, and there's the U.S. Capitol. The left is the Washington Monument. Hear the sound of Canon in D being played by a string quartet, and right in front of me there are protesters. Um, that the idea of being a foreign service officer was a connection to that, a connection to this idea of what can I do actively to change the world, and to take ideas and make them a reality through US foreign policy in this example, and to be at the same time part of this process of making the world a better place, whether that's through development aid or some other means. Um, that became kind of an obsession for me. And so, yeah, around the time I was working at KERA, I remember telling you, I'm going to go take the Foreign Service exams. And I took the exams, I passed them, and it was an incredible experience. I recount in the book how one of my interviewers, or so she's sort of giving me rapid questions of different scenarios that I would have to deal with, say in a plane crash. The plane just crashed, there are Americans on board, what do you do? The ambassador just found out, what do you do? What do you say? Rapid fire over a 40-minute time period. And she had an eye patch, and that's probably the most memorable thing is just having rapid fire questions from someone with an eye patch that apparently she had lost at the Iranian embassy in an attack or something. So all of a sudden it was this really energizing thing. I passed all the exams, and then I'm just at that point in my life and career just waiting. And I remember boarding a plane thinking, looking around for the first time, I think in my life in some ways, and thinking like, I'm going to be part of what helps to protect these people on this plane, my fellow Americans. I'm going to be part of, a system of building a better country and a better world through multicultural understanding and other programs that I will get to be a part of. And I felt really proud of that, but also connecting back to these other freedoms I sought, the thought that, oh, I'll be making enough money to actually like help my mother, because I had
Mm.
struggled at that point to help her pay rent. She was struggling to get the AC turned back on because the landlord refused to fix it, things like that. And so all those ideas were wrapped up in one for me at that time.
So you had passed with flying colors, but while your peers that went through the interview process at the same time started receiving postings, you didn't hear anything for a long time. What did you learn about why?
Yeah, it took almost 2 years. And I sat and I waited. I went on from KRA and I went back to the NGO I'd worked with out of college, did some more travel, um, and just kept waiting. All the while, still struggling financially. I couldn't pay my student loans. There were weeks where my mother and I had no food, so we would, make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Kind of classic story. But I just kept waiting, and what money I did have, I didn't have the energy to cook, so I just ate endless pizzas. And at one point, my mother said, "You're really gaining a lot of weight," which was the thing she said to me in her later years. But um, I waited and waited, and then eventually, the Foreign Service, the U.S. State Department, came back to me and said, sure, well, you're one of the thousands of applicants that took this, and only 8 of you passed, but you have too much student loan debt. And they denied me what they told me was a suitability clearance, and said that meant that I was, say, vulnerable to being manipulated by foreign actors. Um, I remember distinctly just crying because this had become at this point a dream. It was kind of my way out. It was a way I could help my mom. It was a way I could, contribute to these dreams that I had. It was the only hope in some ways that I saw for kind of a better life. And it was gone because I got an education. And I was a little confused about that because I'd always paid my student loans when I could. They told me I'd missed a few payments, and I looked at the months where I missed payments, and there were months where I was helping my mother pay rent. I was helping her with food. And I talked to the lender, and they were fine with, they didn't penalize me heavily. I paid the back. And my thinking was just that, wow, like my ability to get opportunity is so, what's this kind of maze that I'm in? because I have to go to college, I have to get a degree, but at the same time, I have to not get too much debt, which how do I not do that? My family has no money. And then if I want to access an opportunity, now you're going to what? Check that I have debt that I got trying to access opportunity and then deny me the opportunity. We see similar phenomena that I hope don't become bigger around checking credit scores for jobs, things
Hmm.
like that. But it was devastating. It was absolutely devastating for me.
I honestly, since reading your book, this is the part that I can't stop thinking about and the part that I can't stop telling people about because it does feel like you were penalized for the fact that you didn't come from money. But Brandolin, I also feel like this has repercussions for the ability of the United States to build a diplomatic corps that actually resembles America and by extension one that reflects American values other than the values of the wealthiest and most privileged among us.
I think it does, and I think it's a problem that we have to grapple with. And I think it's not unique to the U.S. Foreign Service. The a lot of the sectors and jobs and roles and industries that claim, and I think with good meaning many times, to want to change the world for the better. So this whole kind of world that I learned more about over time, and maybe we'll get into, a lot of these institutions are not accessible if you don't have access to additional income or to wealth. And so think about, I just talked about an example of the US Foreign Service, and maybe they've changed policies in the last, because I'm getting old, maybe they've changed policies in the last decade plus. But even outside of that, when we look at foundations, private and public philanthropy or even corporate philanthropy, when we look at nonprofits, it's very difficult to get those roles. Imagine wanting to work for one of those institutions, say based in New York or Phil or San Francisco or New York, and being someone with a background like mine, which many people do, people of color, people in rural areas. How do you access that opportunity? How do you move to New York and take an unpaid internship and create the kind of network that I now know, because I have it? I now know that you need for a lot of these positions. How do you access that if you can't pay thousands of dollars in rent to be able to live in that place? How do you then join NGOs that are doing work around the world? How do you join nonprofits? How do you join the philanthropic organizations, which a lot of people don't even know exist and that have opportunities for them? And then for the nonprofit sector in particular, once you're in, there are various factors that lead to you getting a low pay. And so, how do you then take care of your family? Does it really, in a world where we now know more and more about how important wellness is, mental health, for example, well being, how do you take care of your mind, your family, your dreams when you're, yes, doing work that makes a difference, but you're not getting compensated for it in a way that really reflects the complexity and importance of the work that you're doing? So, it's a problem that I think about more and more each day, actually. And it's not just limited to our public service. It's about what the things we believe are valuable. In some ways, it's really getting to the point where, as an economy, and my master's is in international studies and economics, so there's an angle for that I think of as well. But at some point, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want to invest in to make the world better, to make our communities better, to make our country better? And are we making those investments, or are we just kind of letting things spin out of control, to a place that we may not want to live in? But yeah, I'm not, I think about that issue a lot as well.
So, Brandolin, you were able to get home and visit your mom. I don't know if it was after a year or some period of time, and something was up with her. What did you notice had changed?
Yeah, at some point I made it back after in this experience in London, where again my mind is being opened up about new possibilities, discovering new kinds of freedom. And I first noticed when my mother and I were taking a ride around town, and we were gonna find Dallas's best brisket spot, brisket tacos. So I will let your listeners, whether they're visitors or residents, kind of figure out where that is in their own imagination. But um, we kind of are talking as we're walking, and I'm having a very simple, I thought, conversation with her about what she wanted. And it was that she had been really living in kind of non-ideal conditions, and she wanted her own place. She wanted this new place. She was asking for my help, but I had just gotten out of grad school. I had nothing. In truth, I was applying to jobs myself, And I never intended to come back to the US from London. That's where a lot of opportunity was for me. Um, so I was talking with her, saying I can't help, asking her very simple questions like, how much does the car cost? Because you need that to get to work. How much does this cost? How much is that? And I'd add up the numbers as I'm driving her to the brisket. And her numbers just don't add up. And I'm starting to think, am I crazy? But no, I'm not crazy. And I get agitated. And that was when I began to notice that her faculties were deteriorating. And then, we sat down to eat and I just looked at her and I hadn't seen her in over a year. And she looked so much older. My mom was always younger than her years, so vigorous. Um, when she was 45, she looked 35. And all of a sudden, she was in her mid 50s and she looked almost 70 years old. She just looked so old, um, and so tired. And that was a really striking moment for me.
So she got progressively sicker while you were there, and one of her doctors finally told you she was dying and that she'd known she was dying for some time. Why do you think she didn't tell you?
I grappled with that question for years. And there was a whole period of my life after her passing where I couldn't watch, for example, a show where a parent got sick or got
Mm.
ill without just bawling my eyes out. Because I felt, for years, my answer to that question was that it was my fault, that I didn't listen, or that she knew I couldn't help. But I felt that in some way I'd let her down. That was kind of the narrative that I'd told myself. But then, after some therapy and some years of distance, I began to see that really just reflect on the fact that I knew my mom and I knew why she would go when she was ill to the doctor and get a surgery and not tell me. And I'd get so angry with her. Why didn't you tell me? And she would say, "You're busy. I know you're working on all these things. I don't want to bother you." And it's really funny because I see those tendencies in myself. I'm often in meetings or conversations. I say, "Sorry to ramble," even if I'm not. There's this part of our personalities that I think we share. And, now that I look back, the narrative that I think is true and certainly that I prefer is that she knew that if she told me, I would have come back from London immediately. I would have given up on everything I've been working towards and kind of struggling to get to this idea of being part of work that made the world a better place and having financial security and being heard and being able to help others. She knew I would give up on all of that because she was that important to me. And I think that's why she didn't tell me or others in the family. She didn't want to bother us if the outcome was inevitable. And I think she was fighting because the doctor, had said that, she's actually done really well, I was told. All of this came out of the blue. I thought I had finally found my mother's coordinating care physician, and we were just going to have a conversation about what steps we could take. And it turned out that, 3 days later, my mother's in hospice, and a week later, she passed away. And I think back to that often, the sacrifice that she made is incredible. It's particularly powerful in a year where, last year, so many people I know suffered loss. And how many died from COVID-19? Those were someone's parents, children. So I've thought a lot about it the past year, but I'm grateful to her. And I wish that I could have the strength that she had when she was able to do that for me and for our family.
So, after she died, you still had to find a job once you graduated from graduate school. You sent out 200 resumes, and for a while didn't hear much. At one point, you tried applying under a name that you thought sounded less black.
Yeah, my middle name is John. So I created a whole, and so your readers or listeners rather have context. I've always kind of been drawn to research and analytics, and that's a big part of what I do now. But I thought, let me take advantage of some of the data I found and put my name John on resumes. It helped a little. I think I got a little few more hits on the same resume, just a different name, but not enough to make a difference. And that period was where I hit my rock bottom, where really I began to I guess struggled the most to just at some point, so my mom had passed. I, had fallen in love with a woman who's now my fiance here in DC, and she had gone off to university herself for grad school. I found myself alone in Dallas, just applying to job after job, feeling hopeless, feeling like, what's the point? I failed the person that needed me most. All those emotions were kind of roiling inside me or raging. And, at one point, just as I was about to give up, I got invited to take an unpaid, they called it a returnship for graduate students in San Francisco, of all places, which is such a ridiculously expensive city. And I found myself, going to this role with an NGO 2 times a week, doing work, learning about how companies were trying to make the world a better place through their what they were calling their corporate impact or their corporate social responsibility, things that your listeners will be familiar with, like their corporate philanthropy when a company gives a grant or their sponsorships, all of that work. And I was sitting there doing these reports and analyses, but I had nothing. I had less. In fact, I had less and less every day. I was eating 7-Eleven burritos almost every single day because they were $1. My mother had left me a pension of like 75 a month, which every time it came into my account made me want to cry because it was so similar to the amount I'd gotten in college.
Mm.
It was almost the same actually in grad school rather. And it was at that point that again, just started to ask myself, what do I really want? Um, I had been kind of obsessed with some specific careers that I thought would make the world a better place. And they were careers like a US diplomat or working with a US aid agency, a chief of staff with an organization sending dollars and promoting development in the Sub-Saharan Africa, or a big NGO or foundation. And at that time, with that internship, as in despair as I was, I began to discover this whole new world of how for-profit entities were trying to make the world a better place. It's I try every day not to drink the Kool-Aid, but I think at the same time that it's good when more people and more organizations say, at the very least, as an entry point, that they want to do something that makes communities better. And so it was at that time that I started to map out this broader, I call it a social impact space that I live in, that consists not only of organizations your listeners might be super familiar with or even beneficiaries from, like foundations, public institutions, or nonprofits, but also social enterprises, which are companies that make products that are sustainable and respectful of the environment. Big companies who are trying to create networks of nonprofit and good action through their operations, and even investors who are choosing to invest in institutions and companies that respect their employees or actively do things that improve conditions for certain communities. And discovering that whole world became something really exciting for me, and it's the world that I live in now.
What do corporate donors need to understand in order to have their money make a real impact rather than one that simply looks and feels good to the people involved?
When asked or when I contemplate this question, I think about, how I build products. So I've built products at this point as an entrepreneur. I helped design, along with an amazing team, our philanthropy cloud product at Salesforce. I built last year in response to COVID. I moved to a different team and designed a wellness platform for the company that helped our customers and over half U.S. state governments respond to COVID-19. Um, and one of the things I think about is that experience where when I'm building something that I really want to help a given community, or let's say we call it a persona that I'm trying to serve, I listen to them. I take into consideration their perspective. And it even helps if folks on my team, as I'm building, understand the issues that our customers face and how we might help to solve them. And it's the same for corporate funders or for anyone, because philanthropy belongs to all of us, something I say all the time. Anyone trying to do good, it's about listening. And I always ask folks to imagine someone comes to your town and they say, we want your town to be a better place. But no one from your town is on the board of that organization that's coming in or a decision maker. If companies want to do good, they have to bring in voices that understand the problems that different communities face, diverse voices, voices from rural communities, and have them be part of the decision making at the organization. That's how you create anything good, better products or a better world.
One lesson before you go, one lesson you learned along the way was the importance, and you alluded to this earlier, of building a meaningful network. What does meaningful signify to you that people might not immediately understand?
I think meaningful, the most important aspect of that is people that believe in you and you know will help you. And that's the core of why I wrote the book, because I want folks who read it who may be going through these kind of struggles, especially after COVID-19, to know they're not alone, that there are people that believe in them, that will help them, and that their dreams matter. And that it only takes one job, one opportunity to change your whole life, and just don't give up because there are people out there like myself and others who want things to be better.
Brandolon Barnett is head of corporate social responsibility industry solutions in Salesforce.org's Philanthropy Cloud and leader of the Democratized Ventures Investing and Advisory Institute. His memoir is called Dreams Deferred: Recession, Struggle, and the Quest for a Better World. Brandolon, it's been wonderful talking with you. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Think is a production of KERA in Dallas. Our team includes Stephen Becker, Paige Phelps, Ana Perez, Nilofer Arsala, and Micaela Rodriguez. You can listen to Think wherever you get your podcasts. As always, I'm Chris Boyd. Have a great day.